The following program is brought to you by coronavirus and the newest in the beta coronavirus line, COVID-19. Coronavirus, bringing human misery for 8,000 years. And by the state of Wisconsin's prohibition on gatherings of more than 10 people. Wisconsin, forward. And by the faculty and staff of Lawrence University.
Hi, welcome to Historic Preservation, Lecture 2, on the history of historic preservation. We're going to begin our history of historic preservation in 1853 with the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. You'd think the Mount Vernon Ladies Association would be doing something, I don't know, like crocheting. But in fact what they did was that they found Mount Vernon in a state of disrepair and generated funds in order to help restore it, as we've heard about in the last lecture, remember, restore, and to turn it into a museum, essentially, for George Washington. It was the first building landscape in the United States ever to be the focus of a true historic preservation act. And it's interesting to note that it was done purely by volunteers. Last time we were talking about volunteers and their importance to historic preservation, even though there's some tension between historic preservation volunteers and professionals sometimes. The historic preservation movement, as we'll see, was always guided by hobbyists, amateurs, and it begins with Mount Vernon Ladies Association and the preservation of Washington's home, Mount Vernon. Very importantly, Teddy Roosevelt, along with John Muir and some other very influential people in the United States, realized that the expansion westward in the mid to late 19th century had begun to seriously damage many of the great natural beauties, the great landscapes of the West. And so as a parallel to historic preservation of places like Mount Vernon, the preservation of landscapes also began with the 1872 creation of the first national park in the world, Yellowstone National Park. Now, it wasn't for a few years that the National Park Service came into being, and as we'll find out, the National Park Service is the organization that runs or organizes historic preservation in the United States. But we see in 1872, in the creation of Yellowstone, a concern on the part of both citizens, and because Teddy Roosevelt was in the government at that time, on the part of the government, that there is a need to preserve areas that are important to the national mindset, the national culture, and Yellowstone was one of those places. The historic preservation movement continued fairly slowly towards the end of the 19th century. There is an important act, the Antiquities Act of 1906, that we will talk about, that was intended to prevent the destruction of archaeological sites on federal lands, on places like Yellowstone National Park. But it wasn't until the Roaring Twenties, when there was a lot of money and honestly a lot of interest in creating buildings, structures, places, landscapes for the public good. One could see that beginning with the Columbian World's Exposition, perhaps, where Grant Park in Chicago was created. Central Park was created before that in New York. Other landscapes around the country were also created in the same way. And the thought of creating a historic park, so to speak, was developed by Rockefeller, the multi-billionaire, in the creation of a place called Williamsburg, or actually known as Colonial Williamsburg, on the site of what had been the area of the first Virginia government. The House of Burgesses was in Williamsburg. And Rockefeller gave tens of millions of dollars to buy up old houses in Williamsburg and then to reconstruct them. In this case, it's not refurbish or rehabilitate. This is true reconstruction, taking them down to their very beginnings and rebuilding them in a way that would make them look as if they were authentic to roughly 1776. And from doing that, he created a village, Williamsburg, rebuilt the House of Burgesses. The governor's house is there, and it is attempting to create almost a world that you can walk into in which you are transported back through authentic buildings, although reconstructed buildings, where you're transported back to a time, in this case, the mid-18th century, to experience what America was like at that time. And of course, we go back to historic preservation. This is our identity. This is who we are. This is the revolution, what created America. And that's what Rockefeller was trying to get to, or get at. And if we go back to Yellowstone, this is who we are, correct? We are the great natural world of the West. This is part of the American identity. If we go back, George Washington, the founder of our nation, this is part of our core identity. So in all these early examples, we can see that sense of this is who we are, our national identity, being core to the process of preservation. Okay. Sorry about that. Let's take a little break. We'll be back in a moment. And now, full frontal nudity. Okay, we are back. We're now going to move forward a few years to the time of the Great Depression. Right now we're in a very difficult time, lots of people out of work. The Great Depression was a similar time period where unemployment was, I believe, in the 30%. It was a terrible time for many people. It was a deep recession too, so even those who had work, there was not money available, there were not goods available, and as I said, millions of people were out of work. Franklin Roosevelt came in and set up something called the Works Projects Administration, or Work Projects Administration, or something else, but WPA. And in the book, it's called the Work Projects Administration. I believe they use that acronym. We'll find out there's a lot of acronyms in this class. The WPA put people to work. And one of the things the WPA did was establish the Historic Architecture Building Survey, HABS, with the job of going around and recording with great detail and with beautiful drawings that still exist historic buildings around the United States. It was the first careful and systematic attempt to catalog and record historic structures in the United States. And it continues in part to this day. The other thing that developed out of the 1930s was the National Park System as an organization. And the National Park System was established to manage the national parks, but also to manage HABs and to manage some of the work that the WPA was doing, for example, here in Butler County, Kentucky. The WPA put tens of thousands of people to work doing archaeological projects. Normally these were just day laborers who were out of work, and they were given good paying jobs to do archaeology, but professional archaeologists ran these projects, and some of the best archaeological work that has ever been done, at least some of the greatest scale in terms of the size of the excavations that were ever done, were done under the WPA. So the WPA gives us tremendous information about the past and about the historic structures, and a focal agency which coordinates all of that. In 1949, the National Trust for Historic Preservation was established. This is essentially a monetary fund that was intended to help to identify, purchase, and preserve historic structures. The first building purchased was Woodlawn Plantation, which, as you can see here, was in a remarkably decrepit state when it was bought, and now it is a gem. This is sort of like Nature Conservancy or Audubon Society, in that this was really a private organization that was being funded primarily with donations from wealthy patrons to try and do historic preservation. So again, we're getting back to this idea of a grassroots effort, this idea of citizens taking responsibility, especially wealthy citizens, taking responsibility for preserving places. It's not surprising this is in the aftermath of World War II, where national identity was both established through that crucible of war, but also was becoming somewhat fragmented in the aftermath of war. When people come back, they're not employed, they've experienced this horrible time period in their lives. And so the core of national identity is seeking a way to be reestablished. And the National Trust did that by buying and, in some cases, restoring and preserving important buildings. Okay, time for another short break. We'll be right back. Please give your attention to this important public safety announcement.
Hello! It's Dr. Budelheimer here. As you can see, I am outside. You're probably in your living room right now, watching Green Acres, or Andy Griffith, or Hogan's Heroes. That is my favorite. It has that silly Sergeant Schultz. I know nothing. I see nothing. And also the star was a pervert. And yeah, so I suggest you go outside and have a nice time in the air and the sunshine. It's good for you. You could walk your dog or your kitty, or like me, your monkey. You want to touch my monkey? Then you can't, because you're there and I'm here. Okay, auf Wiedersehen, tschüss, bye-bye.
Okay, we're back. We're moving on now to the really crucial event that changed historic preservation in the United States forever, and that is the destruction of Penn Central Station in New York City in 1963. You're seeing a film about this, and you'll read about it in your book. It was an absolutely seminal event, and here's why. Penn Central Station had been built in that sort of turn-of-the-century, roaring 20s era where there were multi-billionaires who were spending money for the public good. In the case of Penn Station, it was the Pennsylvania Railroad, the biggest company at the time in the United States, or at least the wealthiest, and I think it had the most employees. What they built was a beautiful edifice, an absolutely stunning classical architectural structure covering something like 6 or 8 city blocks in the heart of New York City. And it was seen by people from the 20s through the 60s as the heart of New York City. It was a place that was iconic, as iconic maybe as the Twin Towers had been, or now the memorial for them is. But it was the icon of the city. It was owned by Penn Central, or the Pennsylvania Railroad corporation. And so after the trains stopped being central to transportation by the early 60s and people were traveling by aircraft or cars, they could no longer afford to maintain Penn Central Station. The land was worth far more, here right in the middle of Manhattan. The land was worth far more than the station was, and Pennsylvania Railroad was losing money by maintaining this, especially since they were sitting on amazingly valuable land. And so they sold it to developers to knock it down and build Madison Square Gardens. Here it is, same location, knocked down. To New Yorkers, this was an absolute punch in the gut. They were taking the Pennsylvania Railroad, as a private entity, was taking what for them was a public monument, was a central piece of their identity as New Yorkers, and simply destroying it for money. And that struck a lot of people as just wrong, and a lot of very powerful, wealthy people living in New York, that one just can't wantonly, even if you're an individual, take something, an icon of such great cultural and historical importance, and just knock it down. There must be some process for trying to mitigate the loss of a structure and the monetary value of a structure. There must be some way, even if it's private property, for mitigating those circumstances or trying to resolve them somehow. Out of that was born the modern historic preservation process, the laws that you'll learn about in this class, the many acronyms you will learn in this class. That all comes about because of this one event. It should be clear from what we've talked about that there was a long history before it of recognizing that there are important places and landscapes that should be preserved. Those efforts were largely private until Penn Central destruction happened, and then federal government, the public sector, got much more interested in historic preservation. 1966, the seminal document of historic preservation in the United States, called With Heritage So Rich, created by the National Trust, put forward a vision for historic preservation in the United States that helped to bring about the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Register for National Register of Historic Places. National Historic Preservation Act, the National Register, in 1966. These two things, the law, the National Historic Preservation Act, and one of its outcomes, one of the things that it put in place, the National Register of Historic Places, form the core of historic preservation in the United States today. We will go through in some detail the National Historic Preservation Act. The National Register is something you've probably heard of because, for example, Main Hall is on the National Register. There are strict criteria for a structure, a landscape, an archaeological site to be listed on the National Register. And National Register listing is the key criteria for historic preservation today. In order to be eligible for being preserved in any of the ways we talked about in the last lecture, a place, archaeological site, landscape must be eligible to be put on the National Register. Now, it may not ultimately get on the National Register, but the preservation process begins if something is deemed eligible to be on the National Register. And the entire process then revolves around putting places, structures on the register. Once a building or a landscape or a site is on the National Register, it is protected in the sense that it cannot be wantonly destroyed. It can be destroyed. We could tear down Main Hall today, but we can't just do it. We need to go through a process in order to do it. And that's the whole thing with Penn Station, going back to Penn Station. Penn Station was torn down because the board of a company decided they needed the money for the land. Today, they couldn't do that. They would first have to go through a process called mitigation to weigh the public interest in the historic building with the private interest of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. And that would be a negotiation that would end up with some solution in the middle ground. So, we could tear down Main Hall. But to do that, we would need to work with the city of Appleton and the state of Wisconsin to see if there wasn't an alternative we could come up with that wouldn't involve tearing down Main Hall, or if we were to tear down Main Hall, if we could preserve parts of it, maybe the front facade, or if we could do something else to repurpose Main Hall so that it wouldn't go away. That's what this process does, and we're going to go through that in some detail in this class. Another very important event that your book, I think, plays down was the bicentennial in 1976. Now, I was a, 14-year-old little greasy, pimply-faced kid in the bicentennial, but boy, do I remember it. It was a big deal in the United States, 1776 to 1976. The National Register, having been put in place 10 years earlier, was somewhere that groups could go in thinking about the bicentennial to try and bring heritage and thought of heritage and that whole idea into their own communities. And so the bicentennial really launched the active hobbyist form of historic preservation that we see across the country today. And so here in town, 2 properties were put on the National Register in direct relationship to the bicentennial. The groups that put these on the National Register were encouraged, and it sparked their imagination and their action that the bicentennial was coming up. And those are Hearthstone Historic House, which is over on Prospect at the Oneida Street Bridge, the Memorial Street Bridge, a late 19th century house, the first hydroelectrically lit house in the country, and the Greenough Mansion, which is in Kaukauna, an 1830s Greek Revival structure, perhaps the earliest surviving structure in Wisconsin, certainly the earliest surviving formal dwelling house like this, not just a cabin or a small building in Wisconsin, and a very important place for Wisconsin history. We were going to spend time here and perhaps time here if we were not doing this remotely. Again, sorry about that. But the bicentennial really launched a lot of interest in historic preservation, and we can tie at least these 2 historic house museums in town directly to that event. Okay. Oh, hello again. Once again, I'm working from home, and I thought we'd read a little bit more out of the book. This, we're reading from Practical Heritage Management on page 11. Towards the bottom, penultimate paragraph on the page. For the purposes of this book and its discussion of cultural heritage resources, as they are addressed by federal law, as well as by both state and local laws, heritage consists of tangible remnants of the past, that are places deemed worthy of preservation because they are eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places, or are cultural items required to be preserved or protected by law and standard professional practice. An interesting statement, it seems to me, and one that seems to reinforce much of what we talked about in the lecture. What do you think about this idea that it is inclusion on the National Register that deems something important enough to be preserved? Is that too high a standard? Or is that the best that we can have? A set of criteria that deems something important on the national level in order for preservation. I'm sorry, I've been smoking too much tobacco. In order for preservation to take place. And actually, this is not tobacco, but don't tell anyone. Preservation. Should it be only those things of national importance? We do have local preservation boards and local preservation ordinances, but the core of preservation law is about the National Register. Think about that as you read, and think about what that means for historic preservation in the United States. See you later.